I want to just reference a very shocking story that was in Canadian newspapers, and it has to do with a young Bangladeshi Canadian in his early 20s who murdered his entire family. "I've just slaughtered my entire family," killer tells friends. This young fellow's name was Menhaz Zaman. He murdered his father, he murdered his mother, he murdered his grandmother, and he murdered his sister. And all of this is kind of linked to the problem of academic pressure. He wasn't performing well in his studies in university, and he figured that, well, once my parents find out that I've actually flunked out of university, that I've just been pretending to be going to university for the past few years, when actually I've just been playing arcade video games, my parents will be so ashamed of me. My parents will be so hurt, they will lose face, they will be embarrassed. So it's better if I just put them out of their misery by killing them. This was the justification of this fellow Menhaz Zaman. Now, most Bangladeshis are Muslim. There were photographs in the newspaper. This story popped back up into the newspapers because the killer had actually pled guilty, and he's been convicted of first-degree murder. The Muslim community in Toronto was shocked. The family, the victims of this fellow, were given a traditional Muslim burial. They were given the janaza prayer. But one of the interesting details that came out of this case is that Menhaz Zaman was not actually Muslim. By his own very open and candid admission to his friends that he was communicating with through online video games, he said that he had left Islam, and not only that, but he specified that he is now an atheist. So this raises the question of whether on an atheistic worldview, a person like this boy, Menhaz Zaman, can actually hold to any kind of standard of objective morality. Who is to say what is right and who is to say what is wrong? If this life is the only life that we have, and if Menhaz's parents were going to spend the rest of their life in emotional turmoil, in pain, in sadness, in shame, then who's really to say from Menhaz Zaman's perspective, or who would be able to say to Menhaz Zaman that what he did was morally wrong? Especially when we slide into the problem, into this secular, liberal, humanist problem of trying to measure evil and trying to measure morality by quantifying suffering. In other words, something that causes suffering is evil. Something that causes unnecessary human suffering is something which is evil. So on that moral view, on that moral outlook, who are we, who are you, and who am I to tell Menhaz Zaman that what he did was a merciless act, or that it was a cruel act, or that it was an immoral act or an evil act? Other than society's judgment, which I think by now we all realize society can be wrong. We can think of very simple examples. The simplest, most non-controversial example would be the Nazi Germany laws that persecuted and ultimately killed Jews in the Holocaust. Well, that society's laws said that that was correct. But the rest of us would still say, intuitively, instinctively, we would say that that was morally wrong. Today in China, it's morally correct. It's fine, it's legal, according to the laws of the country, to round up innocent Muslims in the Xinjiang province and to put them into detention camps, to torture them, to separate them from their families, etc. That doesn't mean that it's morally correct. If you are a non-Muslim watching this video who is anti-Islam, who hates Islam, who doesn't like Muslims, who doesn't like me because of the way I look, I can give you examples that work for you as well. So in many Muslim countries, homosexuality is outlawed. If you are a homosexual, if you are an open homosexual, or if you are caught in the act of homosexual sex, there will be legal ramifications, negative legal ramifications for that. That's the law. But do you as a non-Muslim agree that those laws are morally correct? So similarly, Menhaz Zaman could say that the Canadian laws are incorrect on this matter, or the Canadian laws have not taken my specific individual case, my specific family situation into consideration. I know my family and my parents better than the Canadian law system does, and I don't want to put my mother and my father, my grandmother and my sister through shame and through that kind of emotional pain. And since I don't have to face any kind of ramifications in an afterlife, I'm not going to be judged by the Creator. I'm not going to be judged by God because there is no God and there is no afterlife. Hey, you know what? I'm actually going to make a sacrifice. I'm willing to go to jail. I'm willing to suffer so that my parents and my family don't suffer. That is a solid, logical argument on an atheistic worldview. Is this reading too much into it? Is atheism simply the absence of beliefs, and therefore an absence of beliefs would not have an impact on your behavior? No, atheism, especially hard atheism, is a belief. It is taking a stance on the existence of God and on the existence of afterlife. So how do we know that Menhaz Zaman was thinking along a similar lines as I just explained right now? Well, because he kind of tells us that. I'm reading from the Toronto Star. This came out September 25th, 2020. And in the Toronto Star, Zaman is quoted by his online video game friends as having said that he did this, quote, "because I don't want my parents to feel the shame of having a son like me. I choose to kill them instead out of cowardice. Due to me being an atheist, I believe this is the only life we get." In another quote by Zaman, which I found online, it's almost in similar language in that he clearly says, "I do not believe in an afterlife." That's the same thing that he's being quoted here as saying as well too, essentially. Due to me being an atheist, I believe this is the only life we get. I know it might sound confusing, but what's done is done, and what has been planned has been concluded. I'm sorry if this makes you upset. So this is an example where an atheist criminal, an atheist murderer, does what most atheist criminals and murderers wouldn't feel the need to do. He actually gives voice to his atheistic beliefs, and he quotes it in a context which is relevant to the crime, to the murder that he just committed. In trying to explain, in trying to logically and perhaps morally justify the killings that he just committed, he's telling his online video game friends that due to me being an atheist, I believe this is the only life that we get. In other words, my parents living a life of shame in this life, there's no way they can be compensated for that in the next life. There's no way God will reward them for being steadfast. There's no way that the Creator will reward them for having been patient in this life. No, this life is the only life that my parents get. I don't want them to live a life of shame, and I'm putting them out of their misery. Now, of course, most atheists are not crazy murderers. Most atheists are not going to go and murder their families. And we are not saying that atheists are going to be compelled to act in such an immoral manner, in such a criminal manner because they don't believe in God. All that we're saying is that if they do follow the laws, if they do avoid such criminal acts, it is due to some other reason, like societal pressure or the laws of the land, but it is not due to them holding to any kind of certain objective morality. And Menhaz Zaman is just one of the few who actually voices and articulates his thinking process. He actually lets us into his mind and helps us to understand the logic of his thinking, which I can't argue with. On an atheistic worldview, if I look at it from his perspective, I think his logic is super tight. Abandoning religion, abandoning Islam and taking on atheism as your worldview or as your ideology does not make things any better. In a dark universe where there is no caring God and where there is no afterlife, when there will be no ultimate justice that is meted out in the next life, this actually renders human suffering completely meaningless. In other words, if I were to become an atheist, I wouldn't have a better moral explanatory mechanism by which to explain the existence of suffering. Rather, on an atheistic worldview, suffering, human suffering, is rendered completely useless and meaningless. There is no moral point to suffering. As for the more theological question of how to explain the coexistence of God and evil to an atheist, well, that is a theological question. And as an atheist, they really have no business or interest. They should have no interest in such theological questions. For example, how would you even prove the existence of evil? What is evil? Is it something that you can prove to me scientifically? Can you put it under a microscope and show me and say that's evil? What's the physical composition of evil? What are the physical qualities? What is the chemical composition of evil? Well, there is none. So on an atheistic worldview, atheists are actually piggybacking on the backs of religion when they even talk about evil. Because on an atheistic worldview, there is no objective standard of evil. Me murdering another human being is no more evil than one animal killing another animal in the jungle. It has the same moral equivalence, which is that of no moral significance or meaning at all.